Bonjour, je m'appelle Tom Sanders, je suis directeur du département stratégie de perspective et je vous souhaite la bienvenue à ce cycle de séminaires organisé autour du concept de densité urbaine. Ik wens u van harte welkom op deze reeks van seminars die georganiseerd worden in het kader van het themajaar over stedelijke dichtheid. Comme vous le savez peut-être, Perspective est l'opérateur de la région de Bruxelles-Capitale, chargé de définir une stratégie de développement territorial pour Bruxelles. Perspective s'appuie sur le travail d'experts statistiques et d'experts territoriaux pour réaliser des diagnostics précis, mettre en évidence les enjeux urbains et définir les cadres stratégiques et réglementaires du développement de la région. De opdrachten situeren zich op alle niveaus, van stratenblokken tot de grootstedelijke of zelfs Europese ruimte. En op alle niveaus zijn de voorwaarden dezelfde. Een diagnose verfijnen, de stedelijke problematieken belichten, een visie bepalen en daarna een strategie uitstippelen om die visie te vertalen in concrete stadsprojecten en het leven van de Brusselaars te veranderen. Door deze weg te volgen heeft Perspectief het gewestelijk plan voor duurzame ontwikkeling opgesteld, dat in 2018 door de Brusselse regering werd goedgekeurd. Het GPDO, zoals we het noemen, is eigenlijk het Brusselse stadsproject. Een mijlpaal en een aaneensluiting van projecten en energieën om vorm te geven aan een duurzame en inclusieve stad. De quelle ville avons-nous besoin demain? C'était la question posée au moment de réfléchir sur le projet de ville bruxellois. Et c'est la question qui se pose aujourd'hui, plus que jamais, au moment de mesurer l'impact de la pandémie sur le fonctionnement des centres urbains. Et ce, alors que les enjeux climatiques doivent faire l'objet de réponses structurées, globales, transversales, volontaristes. Dans ce contexte, le concept de densité fait débat. Quelle forme, quelle intensité, quels équilibres trouver pour garantir la qualité de vie en ville? C'est la recherche que nous voulons mener dans le cadre de la mission Projecting.brussels pour poursuivre la dynamique autour du projet de ville bruxellois. Et c'est dans ce cadre que nous aurons le plaisir de nous retrouver tous les mardis pendant 6 mois avec des experts venant des 4 coins du monde. Je vous souhaite une excellente soirée.
Je m'appelle Julia Pancratio, je suis chargée de mission Projecting Brussels. Le projet de ville, le plan régional de développement durable, a été approuvé en 2018. Elle constitue la vision de développement de la région sur le moyen et long terme et représente en conséquence les cadres du projet de ville bruxellois. Il tâche de mettre en cohérence un certain nombre d'actions, initiatives, objectifs ou de projets concrets pour former une trajectoire commune au bout de laquelle Bruxelles doit devenir une ville de proximité durable, moderne et inclusive. Le projet de ville constitue les 4 axes majeurs de travail. Construire une armature territoriale, développer un cadre de vie agréable, durable, attractif, développer une économie urbaine, favoriser le déplacement multimodal durable. Perspective étant poursuivre la dynamique autour du projet de ville et garantir qu'il puisse à tout moment faire fonction de cadre général pertinent capable de rendre cohérent entre eux les projets ou les stratégies sectorielles de nombreux acteurs de la ville. C'est l'essence de la mission Projecting Brussels, dans le cadre lequel Perspective souhaite mettre en place une planification stratégique dynamique, c'est-à-dire un processus d'actualisation continue du projet de ville en fonction d'évolution de la situation socio-économique et des problématiques urbaines sur lesquelles le projet de ville il proposait ses solutions. Cette mission se structure autour de 3 axes de travail. Un suivi annuel et transversal d'évolution contextuelle de la région, le pilotage d'une concertation des acteurs régionaux chargés de la mise en œuvre des projets de ville, la réflexion pratique et prospective sur les thématiques des projets de ville. Cette année, donc, la réflexion pratique et prospective se traduit par l'organisation d'une année thématique sur les questions de densité urbaine. L'objectif de cette réflexion est de définir plus concrètement les conditions qui permettent de combiner densité urbaine et la qualité de vie dans les quartiers. Dans ce cadre-là que nous retrouvons aujourd'hui avec ce webinaire, je passe les paroles au curateur de l'année thématique densité, Jérôme Baratier. Jérôme, c'est à vous.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je suis Jérôme Baratier, le curateur qui accompagne Perspective.brussels dans cette réflexion sur la densité de qualité. Alors pourquoi s'intéresser à la densité urbaine? Probablement parce qu'à Bruxelles, comme ailleurs, la densité est la controverse urbaine la plus vive. Ce que nous vous invitons à faire, c'est de définir ensemble une densité de qualité. Une densité dont la perception serait élargie, une densité qui pourrait rimer avec intensité du lien, des usages et de la biodiversité. Alors comment faire? Eh bien, en suivant les 3 temps de la démarche. Le premier temps, vous y êtes, c'est une saison de 6 webinaires où des experts internationaux nous font part de leur point de vue sur la densité. Le deuxième acte, c'est une masterclass qui, avant l'été 2021, permettra d'explorer les chemins d'une densité de qualité dans 6 territoires de la région capitale de Bruxelles. Enfin, rendez-vous en septembre 2021 pour un moment de capitalisation qui permettra à la fois à partir des matériaux des webinaires, de la masterclass, d'un benchmark, de partager ensemble la définition d'une nouvelle densité. Alors, ce soir, nous avons le grand plaisir d'accueillir Meta Berghauser. Meta est enseignante chercheuse à l'université de Chalmers en Suède et elle est la spécialiste des morphologies urbaines. Avec son livre Space Matrix, elle a eu un grand retentissement en mettant en lien les questions de densité et de morphologie urbaine. Mais avant d'écouter Meta, je vous propose de vous munir de votre smartphone pour qu'un petit sondage nous permette ensemble de mieux nous connaître et ensemble, enfin, d'échanger avec Meta à l'issue de son exposé. Bonne soirée à toutes et à tous.
Donc nous allons passer, so we'll go to the next question. So classic question, what's your background? Who do you work for? Where do you work? In what kind of administration or private company? Very interesting. It's probably the first time we have more people participating coming from the private sector, I believe. Okay, so that's already pretty interesting. We have half of the people that answered. I guess once we get to 40, we can go to the next slide. 2 more persons. Okay, I think that's fine. Let's get to the next question. So a pretty basic and straightforward question regarding density. There's a slight advantage for apartments, as we can see. Okay, great. Let's further on. Let's move on. So for you, density is most related with urbanity, pollution, sustainability. Strongly disagree or strongly agree? Urbanity and sustainability are nearly the same. Interesting. Okay, I believe we can go to the next slide now, which is quite an interesting little test regarding to, I think we can go to the pictures before so we can watch them a little bit more. So yeah, pretty straightforward question again. Berlin, Barcelona, Amsterdam, which has the highest density? And Meta Berghauser will answer that question when she will start her presentation, because she came with this this idea for the questionnaire. Okay, so Barcelona, of course, the famous grid. Okay, 46 answers out of 69 participants. That's very interesting. Thank you very much. And the last question, what do you really think is the main reason for this heated debate and this need? Indeed, stopping sprawl. I can see we have some specialists in the room. Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I can see people can think further beyond the city boundaries, how to protect our green fields, indeed. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much for participating. That was very interesting. And I will now leave the floor to Meta. Meta, good evening. How do you do? Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for this, for inviting me, of course, but also for this interesting start with the Mentimeter and the question. I think it's, as we discussed it before, so it fits very well my presentation. So I will come back to a few of those questions. Let's first start my sharing my screen so that I'm not nervous about that. It works?
Indeed, it's fantastic.
Yeah, good. As you introduced me, I published together with Per Haupt a book 10 years ago, almost exactly 10 years ago, which was called Space Matrix. And the coincidence is that next week, a revised edition will be published. Comes from the printer, actually, from the publisher next week, with the same title, with another font, which is shown on this image. And I show it because there's one chapter that is totally new, and I will present a bit of that, which is about the effects of density in relation to sustainability, which we have been doing research on the last 2 years, actually. So that to start off with, and actually the book has been sort of out of print for the last 6 years, so we've received so many questions, so I'm very glad that we now finally can say there is a new publication, almost next week. As was also introduced, I'm working in Sweden since around 10 years ago, originally from the Netherlands, where I did my PhD, which is actually kind of the for publication of this book. So it's a result of a PhD research that I did together with Per Haupt. What I will do today, I will focus on 3 things, kind of 3 chapters, you could say. First, I want to put density a bit in perspective, because in this heated debate that we are in, at least I know in Sweden, but I also know that it's ongoing in the Netherlands, how to deal with the need for densification, but also the risks or the negative backsides of densification for our cities. But to put this into a perspective, a historical perspective, I think is useful. So I will start there very shortly, briefly. Then I will talk about the relation between density in terms of numbers and urban form. So in a way relating quantity to quality, which is kind of the core of the Space Matrix book. And the third part is this new additional research that we did on the density effects related to quality of life in a very broad way. So those are the 3 elements that I will go through. And to start off, to put density in an historical perspective and asking the question or answering the question, how does the density development look if we look through history? And have we been densifying our cities, yes or no, through history? And I use Amsterdam as a case, but it is actually a similar development throughout at least Europe in the same period. And this is Amsterdam, so I mean, we could go back to 1300 when it became a city, but the first image shows Amsterdam in red in 1650. And then you see on the slide a few diagrams. I will just shortly explain them, and then I will go through a few slides going, let's say, forward in time until we land in 2020. So you see one bar which represents the urban footprint, so how much land each citizen in Amsterdam has to live in, to work, to move through the city. So it's all the different land uses that the city is built up from. The next diagram shows the population density in Amsterdam, and we are at the point of 1650, so we have quite a high number of almost 700 inhabitants per hectare at that moment. And then of course you see the map. So when we go through this, we go to 1880, and you see that parts of the last part of the canal city has been added. And we continue to 1900, we continue to 1939, then we come after the Second World War, and I just continue, and I will sort of talk a little bit more about what we see here when we go through it all. So we end in 2020. What you see has happened. We started the urban footprint, so how much land does each citizen has? We started at about 17. And in 2020, we have almost 160 square meters per person. So this is an enormous increase in land that we have available for each person to do all the things that you do in a city. And you see, on the other hand, the population density that has been dropping since 1900. Summarizing these two things in these two diagrams looks like this. So what we see actually that the city, when it started 1400, it has been densifying a lot until 1650. Then it has going up and down a bit, but since 1900 there has been a process of, we could call it sprawling. We could also say that it was de-densifying. So actually less and less people lived in the same, or in, let's say the city grew more in terms of land than it grew in terms of population. But you also see the last 20 years there is actually a change in the pattern, and it's going up a bit again. And this is certainly due to the whole densification discussion that we have been having the last 20-25 years. And you see the diagram below, you see kind of the same development, but then expressed in the urban footprint that I talked about earlier. And that has been very stable for a long, long time between 1650 and 1900, going a bit up and down, but relatively stable. And then it sort of peaks to the high number of 160, and then it has been dropping a little bit the last 20 years. This is, as I said, this is not a specific pattern for Amsterdam. It's actually a pattern that you see all over Europe. And from a study from Angel from 2011, I found the same actually all over the world. This is a representation of 25 cities all over the world from a little bit shorter period, 1780 to 2005. But you see all the lines going actually down. So decreasing in density is the development pattern for all these cities, from Algiers to Manila to Mumbai to Paris, London, Sydney. And that represents, I put London here in red. It shows pretty much the same pattern, less detailed than what we did for Amsterdam, but pretty much the same sort of development towards lower and lower density. And the reason for this is, of course, there are various reasons. One important reason for all of these cities is that the average occupation rate has been decreasing over the last 100 years. So we live with less people in one dwelling, simply said. Another trend in this period is that we have added a lot of new land uses, not least green areas. The highest, the one that goes most up is green areas in Amsterdam. And that has increased, this is from 1920 or 1930, it has increased enormously. You also see in the dotted line, this one that I put my mouse on now, is the amount of dwellings that actually has been reducing around the 1970s and 80s. The third trend, which is important, is that the dwellings have become bigger and bigger and bigger over time. So we live with less people in bigger apartments or houses and added a lot of other land uses. All these trends have contributed to the final outcome, let's say, that we live in less dense cities today. There has been another thing going on. So around 1900, a lot of the cities in Europe had faced a lot of health issues, problems of living in overcrowded small houses with many people. And that resulted in health issues that sort of peaked around the pandemic, for instance, in Amsterdam, 1866. And what happened, or what was seen when they started mapping the death rates in different neighborhoods in Amsterdam, they saw that those neighborhoods that were most compact and most dense actually faced the biggest problems of the pandemic. And this has kind of triggered a lot of new regulations, new guidelines, and actually made planning a sort of a more important part of how cities were growing. Instead of just that a sort of a natural growth happened, we started to plan for it and we started to regulate it. And there are many examples all over Europe of this. I show here just two, where we, for instance, started to regulate the width of the streets in relation to the heights of the buildings. And this immediately affects how dense you can build if you start regulating that, if you put a limit to the height of the buildings, for instance. In Berlin in 1925, you had very detailed building regulations that also limited the density. So the whole thing actually, that the whole debate and discussions and the professionals started to call for a lower density. There were even economic feasibility studies of what, let's say, what the reasons were for densification in terms of economic profits. And Unwin proposed that, well, actually, there was nothing gained by overcrowding, and made a huge study out of this. I put this, let's say, to sort of, it's not the first time we debate or we discuss density in cities. The challenges of today are very different from 100 years ago. And therefore, the answer is also different. So, and I will not talk about this too much, because we all know we have the challenges of climate change, we have the challenges of all the other planetary boundaries that we are facing, and we have a huge urbanization trend. So meaning that the answers of a more sustainable way of living is partly found in cities. So how we let our cities grow. Do they do that in a compact manner, more dense, or do that in a sprawling manner, like the answers that was given, is one of the biggest issues, you could say. And I think these two images, or these two, one is the UN Habitat Sustainable Neighborhoods Planning Principles, is a very important one that has been influencing planning and the debate now for around, well, this is from 2015, but before that, the debate on densification started already with, for instance, the Newman and Kenworthy publication from 1989, where they showed that density directly relates to transport-related energy consumption. And this graph shows that if the density increases, the energy needed for transport decreases. The red dots are American cities, then we come to the gray dots, which is Europe, and we end here with Hong Kong on the far right. And this study has been repeated many times and referred to in all let's say almost all the studies that you read about density refer to Newman and Kenworthy from 1989. And that has resulted in the end, let's say, by UN Habitat's new 5 principles, where they say one of these 5 principles that we need a high density. So instead of 100 years ago that we said we need lower densities, today we say we need high densities of at least 150 people per hectare. If we put that in the diagram of Newman and Kenworthy, this is all the ones on the left, all these cities are not part of the solution, which is kind of shocking. Now this puts actually something on the agenda that I will address in the next part, and that is, what do they actually mean if they say 150 people per hectare? On what scale is it? Do we mean on the city scale? Do we mean on the neighborhood scale? What are we actually talking about? And that's a big problem in the debate about density, is that we don't really know what we talk about. So I will start the next part, which relates the quantification of density and the way you can measure it, but also how you can relate it to more qualitative descriptions of urban form. And I think this is highly needed to understand actually what the numbers mean. And as long as we don't understand that part, it's very hard to have a sort of a debate that goes forward, and that it's not only we are for or against densification. To come further than that, we really have to understand in all its complexity what density is. And to start off with measuring density, we have one part is let's say how to measure it. I mean, it's always an amount of something in relation to a certain land, a piece of land. It can be people, like I discussed earlier, but you can easily translate that into dwellings per hectare, or you can translate it in the more planning measure, which is floor space index, or in American terms, floor area ratio. These three they're not the same, but you can relate them to each other, and they can be relevant, all three of them. But in terms of planning, often we talk about floor space index. In terms of many studies on the effects of densification, we often end up with inhabitants per hectare, because that's the data that you easily can gather. But it's good to be able to relate them to one another. So that's one thing. The other part about measuring density is the different levels of scale that I already touched upon. And what you see here is on the left side, we could call this a block, an urban block, or a street block, as it's called in urban morphology, or in French, îlot, or island, defined by the street network around it. So often it's private land, and that's the land that a developer can then build on further. This can further be divided in plots, of course, but let's stick to this street block or island. That is one definition and has a certain density on that scale level. If we extend it, we put this together into an urban fabric, that's what you have on the right side, and the density decreases because we add a lot of streets. One can go further. You can add parks, you can add a canal that goes actually beyond the urban fabric, and then it's what we could call the district, and the density drops because we added a park, we added a canal. And you can go even further, and then we come, for instance, to city level, and the density drops even further. So when UN Habitat says we need a density of 150 inhabitants per hectare, on which of these scales, and you see the difference between, it's from going from 0.75 to 2.9. That's a huge difference, let's say, depending on which scale we measure density. And the third element of measuring density is how it actually relates to the qualities that we see when we move around in the cities. And this is the image that you looked at. And I think everybody, or the majority, said that number 2, which is an example of Barcelona, had the highest density. But if we put this in the diagram, which is called space matrix, the same as the name of the book, you can actually see that they all have the same floor space index of 1.9 approximately. So on the y-axis of this diagram, which is called the space matrix, we express what we normally see as the measure of density, floor space index, which, as I told you before, you can translate into dwellings per hectare or in population density. And these three actually have exactly the same, but very, very different qualities. And that's kind of the interesting thing of the space matrix, that it adds variables, density variables, that we normally not relate to each other, but that are actually very much defining the qualities of a neighborhood. The one, a very simple one, that we add is ground space index, which is the coverage. So how much footprint does each building need? Example 1 from Berlin only needs 12%, so 0.12. 12% of the land is built upon. The rest is open space, can be green, can be parks, can be streets. In number 2, the Barcelona example, it's 25%, while in number 3, the Amsterdam example, it's 45%. And because of this distribution of the footprints, actually in number 3, you only have to build 1, 2, 3, 4 stories high on an average to reach the floor space index of 1.9. So these lines, these dotted lines in the diagram, they represent the mean height of the buildings in an area. So number 3 has 45% of the land is occupied by buildings. These buildings are on an average 4 stories high, and that together makes that the density in terms of floor space index is 1.9. And the same goes for number 2, that has 7 stories high, and number 1 needs 13 stories high, 13 floors to reach the same floor space index. So these variables, they are mathematically linked to each other and together describe an urban environment very, very well. And I can show you many examples. We did a lot of studies and looked at different neighborhoods in different cities in Europe. But here are 3 examples that have the same building height on an average, but very different distributions. So one is on number 1 is villas or 2 houses under one roof, closed building blocks and very compact building blocks, but all have 3 stories high. And because of that, they reach different densities in terms of floor space index. Another measure that I didn't mention yet is what is called open space ratio. That was already invented in the 1920s in the Berlin building regulations. And it says something about the intensity of the unbuilt space. So how much buildings do you have and all the floors included in relation to the amount of unbuilt land? You can imagine that if everybody in these 3 neighborhoods living and working in the buildings, the black parts of these drawings, if they go out in the unbuilt space and distribute themselves, let's say, equally, evenly over these unbuilt spaces, how crowded is it then? And in these 3 cases, it will be exactly, have the same crowdedness, the same intensity of people in the unbuilt space. So it's the relation between FSI and this GSI, which is expressed in open space ratio. This seems very complicated, but it's actually relatively simple. If you know 2 of these variables, the other ones follow because they're mathematically related or linked to each other. And these are the 3 areas. So you can create very different areas, but in these areas, every person living and working has the same amount of unbuilt space. What we also found is that similar neighborhoods cluster in the diagram, meaning that we can actually describe density and typologies in terms of FSI, GSI, and building height and this open space rate. And we can draw a circle. We can actually say we can plan for an area and push and define it by numbers, but at the same time we define then the qualities in terms of urban form that we will get, because you cannot create villas if you are in that red cluster that I show now. And we have based this on 150, I think approximately, neighborhoods from different European cities. So these are examples of very compact but low-rise neighborhoods, examples of more spacious mid-rise neighborhoods, very specific for the post-war neighborhoods, and the very spacious low-rise villa areas or countryside areas, the sprawling regions, if you wish. And using this space matrix, in the last few years, we have started developing sort of mapping this on a large scale, so we can do whole cities and not map floor space index in a city or population density in a city, but we can actually map these typologies that relate to the different density variables in a city. So this is Gothenburg, where we have the brownish colors is the most dense and compact areas, and you find it mostly in the inner city. And you can also start calculating then how much land is used for that specific density type. The brownish is only 1%, and how much gross floor area, so how much floor area is dedicated or is distributed for that specific density type. And you can do that for other cities, so Stockholm, Amsterdam, and we have done London as well. To return to this question of measuring density, I want to highlight one thing that is very often forgotten. This image I showed you before, but the interesting thing is if you look at two different scale levels, for instance, the street block and the urban fabric, the difference between these two tells you a lot about block size, about the network density, about the relation between private and public land, which in turn is important for, I will get back to that, but important for the economics of a project. So how feasible is a project if you have a lot of public land but very little private land? It's important for the maintenance of the amount of streets in relation to the amount of private land where you can develop. I will show you later a bit how that works. To understand this better, I made here 4 very, very simple block structures. And you see the black is the building again, and then around that you see the streets that are needed. In the middle you see the courtyard. And then you can measure the FSI on block level, you can measure the FSI on fabric level. And you see that if we make the fabric level or the block level constant, so that's an FSI of 3, you see what happens on the fabric level. In the first case, it drops from 3 to 1.8 because we add streets. We have to access these blocks, so you need to have streets surrounding it. And the bigger the block, the less street you need and the less kind of land is added. And in the last case, you only lose, let's say, very, very little density, you could say, if you go from the block to the fabric. Expressed in a different way, you can say that the percentage of public space that is needed in the first case, this very small block, you needed 40% streets that are added, while in the last case, the very big block of 400 meters, it's 7%. So it's a huge difference. Now you can say, but these are extremes, which is true, but it's still interesting to understand this logic. So the block sizes immediately affect density in terms of FSI, but it also immediately affects the amount of streets we need. It affects the amount of yard, so how much open space within the block you have per person, which is 26 square meter per dwelling in the big block, and goes to 20 to 9 square meters per dwelling in the smaller blocks, to 0, of course, in the very small block that doesn't have a yard. And you can express this in this diagram above. So the block size, if the block size increase, we get more and more and more private yard per dwelling. So we win, let's say the citizens, they win on it. What we also see if block size increases is that public space in percentage decreases. So it's kind of a balancing act between where do we put the open space? Do we put it on the streets or do we put it on the yards? So block size is an extremely important variable when we discuss density. We often overlook that. And to sort of put this a little bit in reality, I compare an example of Amsterdam and Berlin, a real case. The example in Berlin is a very big block, in Amsterdam a very small block. And if we compare the density of the block to the fabric, in Amsterdam it drops from 2.8 to 1.8. And we need 37% of street space to sort of access all these dwellings. While in Berlin, you only drop from 2.8 to 2.5 and only need 13% of street space. You can imagine, let's say, the consequences of this, both in terms of daylight performance, noise and air pollution, project economy, maintenance cost of streets, use of the courtyards, walkability. I mean, it has an enormous set of effects. This very often very early choice on how you lay out your streets and the block sizes. Talking about effects, I want to continue with the third and last part, where we try to make an overview of what are actually the effects of densification on the qualities of life. We did this with a systematic review. What we did actually is compared all empirical findings, also all studies that have been looking into densification or density as such in relation to whatever outcome. And we did this through a database search of all scientific studies of the last 30 years. And we compared this to also look, let's say, if there are mismatches between what we know from empirical, from scientific studies, compare that to what practice actually is arguing for. How do this argument look if in practice we say, yeah, we need to densify to stop sprawl, like you said. So we did that for the Swedish practice. So we looked at, on the right side, you see all the municipalities that are in gray that have a comprehensive plan, and we read those plans and looked how do they argue for or against densification. So we looked at 59 of these plans and compared it to the scientific findings of 229 papers that we, through a search scheme, identified as relevant. So they are based on empirical studies that are big enough to make correlation, significant correlation studies. I can't go in detail, let's say, how we did that, but let's say, so we had these two sort of reviews that we compare to one another. And one first thing that you can look into is which arguments are actually used in practice. And that's on the left side here, where you see that infrastructures that goes from, let's say, densification is good because you can have provide more service to the citizens, or it is cheaper for the street network that you have to invest in if you densify cities. So all these arguments are used, and those are used most. Ecology, for instance, is used very, very, very little, only 4%. The effects studied, the majority is transport related. You remember the Kenworthy and Newman study that I showed you from 1989? That study has been repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated in different ways. And there are, of course, things added, but you can say that at a certain moment you know enough. I would say for transport related, we know quite much. So 35% of the studies were transport related. Ecology is also highly represented, 17%. So there's a lot to learn from practice if they look at those studies that actually have been done. More interesting it becomes when we look at the pros and cons. So if we cannot go through it, but let's say we broke down all these big groups, so infrastructure, ecology, into smaller ones, and then put them on a kind of a ranking. So very positive so the arguments are often very positive for the densification in relation to social interaction. So it's good for integration, well-being, things like that. It's also good in relation to crime. And then you go all the way to the right. But there are negative sides, if we look at the argument used in practice in terms of biodiversity, ecology, the ecological conditions, microclimate, things like that. The effects studied, or let's say what the studies, the empirical studies found, is in the same manner sort of broken down in subcategories. And without going into detail, and there, let's say we published papers where you can read this all in detail, but you see that they are not the same. So for instance, recreational green as a negative effect of densification, that there is a lack of recreational green, was not found in the arguments that I showed you earlier. If we look at the discrepancy between studies, so that's one thing that you can sort of filter out if you do such an overview. So where actually researchers found both equally amount of positive effects as negative effects. So there needs more study, or we have to look into detail what's actually going on there. And that is found in social equity, for instance, physical health also, safety in relation to transport. That's not so clear that densification actually is very positive or negative. Half of the studies push in one direction, the other in the other direction. But many others are very, very clear in their findings. What is interesting is where we see a discrepancy with the arguments used in practice, because there's a real mismatch between what practice says densification should do, or they think it does, but where actually the studies from the scientific studies that do not confirm that. Social interaction is one of them. It actually, from the studies, there is very few that show a positive effect. Crime is another one. And recreational green that I mentioned already earlier is another one. Then we have a property value, for instance, where the studies show a very positive effect of densification that increases the housing prices, land prices, while the arguments used in the plans that we looked into, they actually are a bit critical there and see negative sides, or think there are negative side effects of densification in terms of property values. So there's reason, let's say, to look into these, both from the perspective of research. Sometimes there is need of more research to support arguments in practice, but very often practice has missed maybe some of the findings or new findings from research that we highlight here. If we take a sort of group all these very specific findings again in the main groups that I showed you earlier, it is very clear that there is a positive relation between densification and infrastructure, transport, and economics. The majority of the findings, let's say, are on the upside, the green side in these bars. While in terms of ecology and social and health effects, there are actually quite some negative effects. If we compare this summary to the arguments used in practice, you see a mismatch, especially for the social arguments, where practice is very, very positive, while the studies that we looked into are more saying that, well, there are quite many negative effects of densification. So be careful here. So that there is really, in this subject, there is a real need to, for practice especially, to look into these studies and not be over enthusiastic about densification. In terms of health, it's the opposite actually. Although also the studies that we looked into found negative effects, practice is more negative about densification than maybe needed. And that's mostly in relation to physical health issues, because the mental health issues are actually found in the studies that we looked into. So these negative sides are often the mental health problems in relation to densification. And in terms of ecology, actually there is quite some overlap. So that's pretty good. So it's mostly in the social and health effects of densification that we need to look more carefully into what the effects are. To finish up, I want to give you an outlook, because there's much more possible, and I've done much more in relation to looking into what the effects of density are, which I didn't look into now, but I want to highlight one. And that is actually, I think it's an important one that we often also overlook. And this is not really new. So I've been doing this kind of research going from what we call area density to accessible density for quite many years now. And have found that this is very important if we want to look into effects of urbanity, if you want to look into effects of where people move more through cities, where there's more urban life going on, where there is more mixed use possibilities, things like that. So I think, let's say, in the innovations in how to measure density, this is an important step that we took. So I will explain a little bit. So on the left side, it is what we call area density. It's the more traditional way of measuring density, and also very much needed if you want to plan. So we need to define this block or this plot or this neighborhood will have this and this density, and you give it a number. You can put it in the space matrix, let's say, to have to define the multiple variables in relation to density. So that's all on the left side here, what we call area density. And then in this map, the red plots or blocks that you see, they have a high density, and then if you go to the bluish colors, they have a much lower density. If you move to the right side, it uses the same data, but instead of measuring it from each plot or block, like we did on the left side, we measure it through a buffer of walkability. So if you move from one building through the streets, let's say 5 minutes or 500 meters, what do you reach then? How much density do you reach? So you can actually calculate either the amount of people that you reach within these 5 minutes, or you can calculate the amount of gross floor area that you reach within these 500 meters. And then you can again color the map according to high density or low density, which is done here. So the reddish colors have the highest density and the bluish colors have the lowest. Then it becomes very interesting to compare these two. So if you look at number 1, has a very high density on the block. So that property has a high density. But if you actually look at the neighborhood, or let's say what you can reach from those buildings, you don't reach so much other buildings. So in those terms, the density of that neighborhood is rather low. So in planning perspective, it might be interesting to sort of define the FSI, for instance, or the ground space index for that property. But if you want to understand urban life, you have to go to the right analysis at accessible density. Number 2, if we look at that one, has a pretty low property density. So it goes to, the first one had 4, and now we go to approximately number 2. But if we do the same thing and we measure the accessible density, you see it turns red. It has a very high accessible density, meaning that this property, although it has a low density, is located in a neighborhood that you can reach while walking through the streets of a very high density. And probably, which we also found in studies that when we use this measure of measuring density, has proven to be of great importance if we want to understand which streets are more used for walking and in higher intensities of walking than other streets. It's not the property density that is the most important, it's actually the accessible density that is more important. So this is a direction that I've been working on, let's say, for the last few years, especially from understanding urban life and how people use the city, let's say. So not so much from the planning perspective, but from the livability perspective is the direction we went on for the last 4 or 5 years, let's say. And I stop there. Let's see if we can have some discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meta, for this very comprehensive presentation about the scientific aspects of density, as you can see. And please, may I remind you all to switch your cameras off, please. As we will have a couple of questions from the public.
Oui, Nicolas.
S'il vous plaît, pourriez-vous éteindre vos caméras, s'il vous plaît, les invités?
Nicolas.
Oui, je vous entends.
Je veux bien réagir. Je vais essayer de le faire en anglais. Donc, pardonnez la faillite du système français dans l'apprentissage des langues étrangères. Thank you very much, Meta, for your presentation, because you expose very clearly the terms of the controversy around urban density: scale, measure, ground, flood, open space, and the effect. And in the last webinar, David Sim from Gale Agency told us the story of the happy density. Density where public relations, social interaction are improved. For you, it's not the fact in the study you lead. From your point of view, on what condition density can be an improvement of social interaction? It's not the case, but how can we do for improve this interaction?
Well, let's say I think it's these studies that looked into social interaction and also community feeling, and so it's a set of elements that they look into and see in different. So it's not a study that I did. I do a review of these studies, but if you gather those, what I actually say is that to have more people together doesn't mean that they interact more and create a community. That's actually what they say. And if the point is to make a very intense, buzzing street with a lot of people meeting, that's something else than creating community and that kind of interaction. So I think you have to sort of put those, they're two different things. And we mix them up at times. If you want to create this urban buzz and people meeting in the street with a high intensity, then yes, densification will do its job because you gather a lot of people. Then I would say actually the street centrality, let's say the position of that location in the street in the city as a whole is even more important than pure density. So that goes a little bit to the last thing I said about accessible density. Then yes, you create that, but you not necessarily, actually the studies show that you will not create this community feeling that we relate often to social sustainability and interaction in those terms. So I think that's the main point. So you have to be very clear about what you are aiming for and then know what you have to do to create that.
Thank you.
De questions?
Monsieur le maire, qui est dans le prolongement, Nicolas.
Nicole. Nicolas, on t'attend pas.
That's a classic, still going on in 2021. They'll follow us till the end. So we have the question from Pierre Lemaire regarding maybe the condition for density to produce social interaction is diversity of functions and spaces. How would you react to that?
Well, let's say when we did that review, indeed, now I can't recall exactly in terms, let's say, of those 229 papers that we read, but many mention also mixed use. Diversity for many of these aspects. It's both density and mixed use that plays a role. Also there it is important to understand that mixed use often doesn't, let's say, is in need of a certain level of density, otherwise you do not get the mixed use. And also the movement of people, let's say, beyond that neighborhood with a certain density. So I think it is this mixture of ingredients indeed that you often need. But I think especially, again, I would say that this that the idea to bring people together in high density is not necessarily, although it will generate more mixed use, it's not necessarily creating the social, not all kinds of social interaction that we are maybe thriving for. And I think that we have to sort of see that cities, or understand that cities need the whole palette, the whole diversity of these kind of meeting places, and also for that reason you have to sort of densify at the right places to create, at certain places you want to create this more anonymous interaction with a very high intensity of people, and that needs a certain, I mean, there the density cannot be high enough, I would almost say. That's fine. But as soon as you create more residential communities, it has to have other ingredients. And I think we should become much better in creating this gradients throughout our cities of these different qualities, so that you almost sort of, you just take 3 turns from the main road where you have this buzz, and then you come to a much more quiet area with another density and another connection, let's say, to the rest of the city. I think we can create those diversities.
Of course, yes. It's really coming a bit to the question we would like I would like to ask for you. It reminds us, for like the buzzing streets of Tokyo, then you go to the residential areas and it's very, very quiet. It feels like you're in a small village. So as we already have Mr. Sim a month ago, that's also from the same area as you are. He's from Copenhagen. He lives in Sweden as well. He's worked a lot in Northern European cities first and foremost, and as you have, to what point do you believe in the cultural factor regarding how we perceive density? I mean, how is it different from the south of Europe to the north of Europe? What's your point of view on that?
Yeah, I didn't study that. And I'm a researcher. I don't say anything about that I don't really know. But let's say if you indeed, I didn't put that in my presentation, but you have, let's say, you can make a distinction between what the measured density, which I talked about a lot. Then you can, and that is much richer than we often think. So you can actually, through density, describe the qualities of a neighborhood, blah, blah, blah. But then you also have the perceived density where the individual comes in. And that depends on your background and your what you experience on your everyday basis and things like that. That of course affect what you think is very high dense or very low dense. Or I didn't study that, but of course it affects how you perceive a certain density. I'm not sure. I don't think it is so much the northern countries that are so much different from the southern countries. I think it's very much whether you come from a city. I mean, Stockholm is denser than Amsterdam, for instance, on the neighborhood scale. So it's not that, it is more, let's say, what is your daily life? And what do you meet when you walk your street, when you go to school, to your work, and do your groceries? That's what of course, affects. And then if we go to Tokyo, I'm from living in a very small town in Sweden now, and I go to Tokyo, then I'm shocked. If I live there a year, then I go back and I'm shocked again, yeah. Probably. So of course that influences, but I let's say of course that's important, but I've much more studied the effects in terms of let's say the more general effects of densification. If you don't take into account each and every individual that can perceive things differently, let's say if we look at it more in an overarching view, are there thresholds, for instance, that a certain density, even let's say independent from if you are in Japan or in America or in Europe, where density at a certain moment sort of creates a lot of mental problems for people living in these areas? Are those, can we define those sort of tipping points or thresholds? And there are actually, from the study that I did, there are a few of those thresholds that can be defined. That are, let's say, it's not a linear, often it's not a linear relation. It's, let's say, density, if density increases, it provides a positive impact on our health, but at a certain moment it can drop. You can kind of go over that point. And of course, that's not for everybody, but it's, let's say, that if you take an average person, then you can say things like that.
So regarding more legal matters in terms of planning, what would you believe are the parameters that are the most pertinent in order to regulate density in planning documents? How do you impose those views?
Well, that depends a little bit. Let's say, I would say, for instance, the ground space index is a variable that immediately affects how the interface between public and private land is organized. So in places where you have a high, because of the location of the street and the system as a whole of the city, creates high flow of people, there you actually want to regulate the GSI, especially because you want to regulate this interface. But at other places, that's not the most important. Maybe at other places, it's the open space ratio that is more important to regulate. So it depends, I would say. But I would say that these variables that I've discussed, they should all be always sort of discussed. And then you can decide on this one is prioritized in for this street or for this area. Because of its location. So it's I think that's also there, I would say, no, let's put it like this. The other thing I would like to add is, so the variables, they can be different in depending on the location, and location should be linked to streets again. It's not project areas, it's streets that actually define conditions, and that the density variables has to react on. They have to match these two systems, let's say. And that's also something that we've kind of forgotten a bit, at least in planning practice, is my opinion. We are very project-based. Yeah. That's what I see in Sweden. I saw it in the Netherlands. It's a problem.
So regarding the relationship of the streets, the open space, and the building, how do you believe the urban form of cities have evolved in recent times?
It's kind of a patchwork instead of a continuous city. That's what you see a lot. Let's say if you so whole areas have homogeneous structures, typologies, instead of that along the main street it's different from the back street. It can be 200 meters from each other, but and the conditions are very different, but we treat them as the same. So I think it goes again back to this, the gradients through the city, let's say, of density, which variable is most important. I would almost say that one side of a block can be, the GSI is maybe the most important, while the back side of that block, GSI can be not important at all, because it's a back street and it could be actually broken open, the whole block, and connected to the park, which is maybe next to it.
And jumping on that, what you're saying, the front block, the back block, in your variables, has anonymity been taken into account?
Anonymity.
The right to anonymity.
For the citizens.
Is that a bad word? It's an interesting question again. How do you believe we can give the right to people to anonymity in a dense city?
Well, I don't really know, let's say, how. I didn't really look into that. I think it is, I'm not sure, let's say, it's partly related to density, but on the other hand, maybe actually not. I think that, for instance, if you look at not dense areas that changed, let's say, the location of the entrances. So instead of your entrances to the street, you have your entrance on the back side and your private side to the street. I mean, that's a problem of anonymity, that everybody passing looks into your private backyard. So I think actually that's more a problem of the organization of entrances and where you put clear interfaces between the public and the private. I mean, that's much more important than density as such. For that issue, I would say. Then of course, let's say the more people you put together, you can look into each other's windows and things like that. Of course, I mean,
indeed.
Yes, but I think actually through design you can solve many of these issues. I don't think actually it is it's so problematic. And again, if you provide this gradient and this variety, then there are people who do not have an issue with it. They want to live in this constant interaction, while others don't. And if you create a diversity in your cities, then those are not really the problems.
I will let thank you very much. I will let Jérôme ask you a question.
Nicolas, je vous laisse traduire. Je vous remercie de votre service d'avance. Non, ce qui me frappe, c'est que on est à notre troisième webinaire. Jens Hartz nous a parlé de la ville saine et avec la question de la pratique dans l'espace public. David Sim nous a parlé de la densité quotidienne de tous les jours qui favorise les activités et l'interaction sociale. Et Meta, ce soir, on a l'impression que la densité heureuse passe par un vrai projet d'espace public. Et ma question est la suivante, c'est est-ce que, à l'image de Barcelone, de ce que fait Barcelone par exemple actuellement, cette densité humaine forte, elle n'est supportable que s'il y a un vrai projet d'espace public. Nicolas.
So as we are now, as we are at our third webinar regarding density, there's a following line we could talk about. So when Jens Arts talked about the healthy city and the user and how to keep healthy within the city, it was really about public space. When David Sim talked really about the everyday city was more about connections and links between the activities and the usage of the city. And here you really gave us a very interesting presentation about the usage of the total space of the city. It's really how it's more of a public space project. And because you're the first time we really take into account the ratio of the street to the building. And to jump on that, Jérôme asked very interestingly, what do you think about the project of Barcelona, the mega the mega blocks they are creating. I mean, in order to really create a human density with all the different mixes of usage and quality you can have, it must be taken as a larger, the project has to be taken into a larger public space project. You cannot just concentrate on the building. You have to take the whole space. You basically have to go beyond the project. What's your take on that?
Well, let's say that you have to go to beyond the project. That absolutely you have. Let's say that's the. Be it alone to understand, let's say, what is a proper density at that location. You have to understand, let's say, where you are in the bigger picture. And also, and I think also that's the reason I put this accessible density in the end, because if you think about accessible density, you can also start adding accessibility to service, accessibility to green areas, accessibility to, and that creates a palette of qualities. And I would say the daily life of people, let's say, that you had a discussion on last time, is in a way expressed in those analysis that you can do. That if you have a high accessible density, doesn't mean that you cannot have a high access to green areas at the same time. So it's not taking place in one and the same location, all of this. They are distributed, of course, and by designing them in synthesis with one another, you can create actually both this high street with a strong interface between public and private land, a high accessible density, but just around the corner, within 500 meters, you have a park. And if you would have looked only at your project, you would have, let's say, that's not part of the equation. Maybe you would be forced to add green in your project or whatever, dropping the density at a location that it's not very proper to drop your density because you have the high flow of people in that street. So it's, yeah, you have to understand your location in terms of its context continuously to know what you have to do, but also to know what you do not have to do, because maybe you have this park already around the corner.
Thank you. I'll just have to remind everybody that we still just have 5 minutes and then we'll have to wrap it up. I'd like to thank the public. They are asking a lot of questions. We can unfortunately not answer all of them. We have a question here from the public. As the city gets dense, could the open areas rules help against the impermeability of soil? And how is it conjugated with density ratio? Is there any formula, as we have seen a lot of formula from your part?
Yeah, I mean, you have, let's say, also here, for instance, if you look at microclimate issues or heavy rainfall that we have to deal with, a problem there is most of all GSI. So if we have too much pervious surfaces, that can create a problem for these issues. So there are, of course, limits in terms of densification, depending on the location again, depending on whether you are in a lowland or you have no other green areas in your surrounding. So in that sense, yes, there are specific variables that are important for specific effects that you want to understand. So this was one example, let's say, where GSI then is more important. If you want to create this urban buzz at a certain location, then accessible FSI is more important. Let's say that you have enough floor space in close proximity where people work and live in. So there are different variables for different kinds of effects, and then you have to combine those in a smart way. And in gradients, I think that's the whole point. Let's say it's going almost like you could draw a landscape, let's say, through the cities that goes much faster up and down than what we are used to. You have the high street, high density, then it goes down and it goes up and down and up and down.
And just another regarding your research, I have an interesting question here regarding the built environment. As the tendency to maintain social relations seem to be influenced by politics, media, and work. And moreover, if we are merely sleeping at home, we have little reason to interact with others, especially nowadays. Do you think it would be useful, interesting to cross your research with sociology, political, and workology? It's also a big issue for public space quality.
Now, of course, let's say doing interdisciplinary research is kind of key if you want to. So I've worked a lot with ecology, so I've not worked so much with. So we have done studies on segregation issues, for instance, and there we work together with sociologists, looking into, let's say, the importance of meeting in public space to create an understanding of other cultures, an understanding of others, so to speak. Instead of that, we mix people of different incomes in the same neighborhood. You can also say, well, let's meet them, at least let them meet in public space, which is not always the case. We have spatially very segregated areas. So we looked into that, for instance, and I've worked with ecologists to look into the effects of how you organize green spaces in between these densification projects everywhere, that not only creates accessibility for recreation, but also green connectivity to sort of.
Well, thank you very. Sorry to cut you, but thank you very much. It's really interesting that you finish off the question regarding the issue of nature and density, because and first of all, I would like to thank you very much once again to be here. Thank you, Jérôme, again. Thank you, Julia. And I would like to remind everybody that in exactly a month, we will have Philippe Clergeau, who's an ecologue. I don't know how you translate that in English, but it's not an ecologist. It's more complex, I believe. And Marion Waller, which is she's a consultant to the mayor of Paris, which is very much in the news right now, Paris, of course. And we would discuss more really the link between nature and density, or the non-link between nature and density. So we very much look forward to that discussion. Both will be from France, but we will manage to do some English translation, of course, to have the most people possible that can follow us. So once again, I'll remind you that this discussion, this webinar will be online in a couple of days. Thank you, Meta. Tack så mycket för att ni var här. It's very funny, you have two Swedish-speaking presenter in a month. Anyway, merci à tous. Dank u wel allemaal voor deze fijne avond. And I hope to see you all next soon in a month. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.